following Jesus at one point or another is probably going to put you out of sync with your political party. It's maybe going to put you out of sync with some of your personal preferences or your social circle. If Jesus himself had to say, not my will, but yours be done, there's probably going to come a day for you where living with conviction and compassion and courage is going to be out of sync with your first instinct. Well, good morning. Hey, if you got a Bible you can get in front of you, would you get it in front of you and meet me in Psalm 139? Psalm 139 is where I will meet you. It'll take me a little while to get there, but I promise I will meet you there in a couple of minutes. If you got a Bible you can get in front of you, go ahead and head there. If you don't, never fear, we'll put it up here on the screen so that you can follow along with us as well. But we always encourage you to have one, whether it's one that you power up or open up, that's right there in front of you so you can see it right in front of you in black and white and take it with you. Remember where it's at on the page and what it says. And so you can check my math. That's really important to me. What I say matters very little. But what we want to stay focused on is whatever God has said, and we want to be people that follow him in everything. And that especially matters when it comes to things like we're talking about these days in this series. So Psalm 139, I'll meet you there in a minute. This series, and Jay just told you, is part 2 of a series that we've called The Compelling Resistance. We're talking about how to stand in a world of sides. And I've told several of you over the last several weeks, this is a series that I've looked forward to for the last 4 or 5 years, and that I've dreaded for the last 2. I'll tell you a little of the story of kind of how the series came to be. About 4 or 5 years ago, Carrie and I were sitting at a dinner that Dallas Seminary hosted with Tim Keller. Some of you know Tim Keller's name if you run in church circles, former pastor of a church in New York City and a brilliant writer and a thinker and a writer for the New York Times. So an evangelical pastor who also writes for the New York Times. Figure out how that works. You get a little sense of sort of his brilliance. And before you think I'm name dropping, there were a lot of people at the dinner. It wasn't just us, sitting there having dinner with Tim. We're not buddies like that or anything. But as he was talking, he was just kind of vamping on some of the things he was thinking about those days. And he said something almost as an offhanded remark that just stuck in my soul. And I started taking notes. And he said, history always wants to know, how did this small group of people, this original group of people that started following Jesus, the size of a medium-sized community group, how did they, in a world where the culture was moving against them in a whole lot of different ways, how did they not just stand firm? How did they stand out, and how did they make a difference in the world where they lived in some ways that if you trace them back, even some of us that are in this room that don't follow Jesus are really grateful that they made. And history always wants to know, how does that happen? And he said the crazy thing is history and historians are almost completely unified. And historians are almost never unified about anything, but they're unified in answering that question. He says they stood for 5 really important things in that world where they lived. And he started to list them off. He said they were people that valued life in a world that valued death and violence. They were people that thought that sex was sacred. They were people that valued the poor and justice for the poor. And they were one of the world's first, if not the world's first, multiracial, multi-ethnic culture. And they stood with a posture of grace and non-retaliation in a world that was radically polarized and violent. And I thought, we've got to talk about that. I'm grabbing Carrie's napkin and writing down notes on the whole thing. And so we planned it. We put it on the preaching calendar for April of 2020. And the world changed in March. So we spent some time, some months, pastoring ourselves through a global pandemic and some of the other things that happened. But just for a second, think about some of the things that have happened over the last couple of years in relation to those 5 topics. What you begin to notice, most of those topics going into 2020 were already electrified. Today, and over the last 2 years, every single one of them is radioactive. And if that's not enough tension for you thinking about this series, think about this. 5 big topics, ways that the early church stood out. 2 of them, the first 2 that I named, generally, stereotypically, tend to be things that are really near and dear to the political platforms in our world of the political right, religious conservatives, or conservatives, politically speaking. Sexuality and life. 2 of them, justice for the poor and race, tend to be, generally speaking, items that are loud and proud in the platforms of the political left, progressives in our world. One of them, the one we talked about last week, living with a posture of grace and non-retaliation, nobody in our world believes, right? But we talked about that last week, and it's so important to our conversation. And in fact, I would tell you, if you weren't able to be here last week, you weren't here for one reason or another, and I almost never tell you this. Please, 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 please go back and grab that message, because it sets the foundation of what we're talking about over these weeks. And not only what we're talking about, but how we're hoping to talk about it. And that is so important as we begin to move through these topics, especially where we're starting today. Because today, we're going to talk about living as people for life in a culture that values violence and death. Trying to find the way of Jesus, the intersection of conviction and compassion and courage, about a topic that, especially over the last couple of months, is a really tender, exposed nerve in the world where we live. And because it is, I want to say a couple of things, just even right at the beginning as we get started, just name them up front. Okay, first of all, here's what I want to say. It's going to be impossible to be comprehensive. It is going to be impossible to be comprehensive. And here's what that means. For those of us that are the most passionate about this topic, we are going to leave disappointed with something that I simply don't have time to say. It is going to be impossible to be comprehensive. And I want you to hear that. I want to state that out loud. And I just want to cast myself on your grace and your mercy. And if you've been around Doxology for a while, on our shared history of the last 10 or 12 years together. It is just impossible to be comprehensive. It's either that or a 7-hour sermon. So I chose that. You're welcome. Okay, well, with that said, I do think there are some ditches that we can fall into in this conversation that I also want to name out loud, because I think it's really important for us to avoid all of those. Let me name them. The first one is this. There's a ditch, I think that's a miss, to start with exceptions rather than principles. I think it's a miss. There's a ditch there to begin with exceptions rather than with principles. A lot of times when we start talking, and especially when we talk about really hard things, it's really simple to start with all of the exceptional circumstances that we can think of and only ever find principles that have room for every exceptional circumstance that we can possibly imagine. And that's not to diminish the importance of exceptional circumstances. We're going to talk about exceptional circumstances some today, but it is to say when you're talking about really complicated issues and when you're talking about matters of conviction, it's almost always wisest to start with what's clear and move towards what's complicated, rather than starting with what's complicated and trying to find what's clear. I think it's a miss to start with exceptions rather than with principles. And as Christ followers, people that study the scriptures and understand what we would call a theology of sin and brokenness, we have to understand this. One of the things that the Bible's really clear on about sin is that sin brings disintegration. Sin has made the world complicated. And here's what that means. Even on issues that morally feel black and white and simple, the circumstances that surround them, the stories that surround them are almost never clear and simple. And we can't be surprised by that. We have to expect that in a world that's broken and disintegrated, things are going to be complicated. And we've got to be willing to walk into that. I'm not naive to that, and I assume that you're not naive to that either going into this. I've sat in more than one hospital and nursing home room with people who their one prayer request for me before I left was that before I came back, either God or someone else would take their life and let them go to heaven. That exists in our world. On the other side of that, I've sat in the hospital with my very best friend as his wife had surgery for an ectopic pregnancy. They had no choice but to make a choice between two lives. What a horrific decision to have to make as a person. Not only that, there are victims of rape and incest and assault who are worshiping with us this morning. There are children in children's ministry who are God's good gifts that have come out of horrific circumstances that would make your teeth itch if you knew them. And the chances are there is someone sitting within hugging distance of you today who at one point or another in their life, for one reason or another in their story, felt like they had no choice but to choose abortion. Compassion, hear me, is non-negotiable in this conversation. And if we allow our compassion to rob us of convictions, we will inevitably find ourselves without either convictions or compassion. I won't retread that from last week, but that is so important for you to hear as we walk into conversations like this today. Okay, that's the first ditch, starting with exceptions rather than principles. The second big one we've got to avoid is this. We've got to avoid expecting people who don't share our worldview to share our worldview. When you read the Gospels, Jesus and the early followers of Jesus spent a remarkably small amount of time making commands and demands of the culture and even the government around them. They spent most of their time and most of their energy commanding and demanding that followers of Jesus follow Jesus, and then inviting the culture around them to watch, to consider it for themselves. And as a result, again, history proves this out. Over and over, the majority culture around them that was going in a completely different direction looked at Christ followers who actually lived this way and said, I don't know that I agree with your worldview, but I desperately want to live in a world like yours. We've got to find that space too. That's so important as we engage this conversation. We can't be surprised when people who don't follow Jesus don't follow Jesus. But the flip side of that coin, for those of us that are Christ followers, those of us who do follow Jesus have to follow Jesus. Which means we've got to avoid putting our political, emotional, social, or personal filter in front of our biblical filter. We've already said, following Jesus at one point or another is probably going to put you out of sync with your political party. It's maybe going to put you out of sync with some of your personal preferences or your social circle. If Jesus himself had to say, not my will, but yours be done, there's probably going to come a day for you where living with conviction and compassion and courage is going to be out of sync with your first instinct. If we're ever going to be a compelling resistance in the world, as followers of Jesus, we have to be committed to following Jesus. Following Jesus can never first be about our politics. especially when it comes to topics like these that involve people with names and faces and often really complicated stories. Can I give you a couple of examples? Check this out.
I grew up in a Christian home and became a Christian when I was pretty young, and not in a superficial way. I was seriously in love with Jesus. Even so, by the time I was 20, I was looking at the world and living in a mostly secular way. So when I found myself pregnant at 21, it never occurred to me that I could find any kind of support or guidance in the church. Suddenly I was facing this monumentally life-altering situation. I didn't want an abortion, but I didn't see how I could survive the alternative. It seemed impossible. You know, when you're young, even little things can make you feel like the world is falling apart, and this was huge. Not just the financial issues, but the embarrassment, the humiliation. The father was gone. I was completely alone. I decided that abortion was the only realistic alternative. At the clinic, I sat in a room with other women and girls during the pre-procedure group counseling, tears running down my face. I remember the counselor asked me what was wrong, and I was surprised by the question. I gestured to the room and said, "Well, I'm here." A few hours later, it was over.
I have a story too. When I was in college, my girlfriend got pregnant. We weren't ready for that. We weren't ready for marriage. We both knew that abortion really wasn't an option. We were going to the same church and we went to see our pastor. And I was terrified that he was going to tell us that our only option was to get married. But he didn't. But he also told us that abortion was not the right way to go. And he encouraged us to look into adoption. And that's what we did. This decision was, I think, a lot harder for my girlfriend than it was for me, but I invested in it. I dropped out of school along with her. I did the pregnancy classes with her and all those things. And I was with her in the hospital. And for 3 days, I held a little baby girl in my arms. But we gave her up for adoption. It was not easy. I don't want anyone to think it's easy. It was, maybe the hardest thing I've ever done. And for 17 years, not a day went by where I didn't pray for her. 17 years later, I got a letter from the adoption service saying that my daughter wanted to know if it was okay if she contacted me. Heck yeah, it was okay. And about a year after that, we reunited and met, and we formed a relationship. I got to meet her family and her mom and dad, who were fantastic, and her sister, who was also adopted. And now she's married, and she has 4 beautiful kids of her own. It was a pivotal moment in my life, that decision. And it was hard, but I'm really grateful that I made it.
A couple of months ago, I decided to post our stories on Facebook. I was watching the explosion of panic and fear and outrage everywhere, confusion about the facts. I just wanted to be able to have a conversation. We now have 2+ generations of women born into a culture that has loudly and repeatedly proclaimed that they are entitled to absolute freedom. How do we begin to impact the hearts and minds of those young women? I know what it looks like to make a beautiful decision and see the goodness of that choice 18 years later. But I also know what it feels like to be that young woman struggling to recognize her own worth, trying to figure out her purpose in life, and suddenly facing a seemingly impossible situation. We really need to talk.
It takes a ridiculous amount of courage to live and to share both of those stories. And I want to honor that. Andy and Tiffany are both a part of our church family and actually worship in this service and are here this morning. Actually, Brooke's here as well, flew in from where she lives to be able to celebrate and honor the courage of both of those stories that are continuing to be lived. So would you tell them thank you so much for the courage to share that story? Yeah. So Tiffany is totally right. We've got to talk. But what do we say? And how do we say it? Well, this is one of the ways that the early church stood out. And in fact, when you read ancient Roman documents that talk about the Christians in their day, this was one of the first things that they noticed. But it wasn't just about abortion. It wasn't just about the life of the unborn. Abortion was really dangerous in the first century. And so it existed, but it was really, really rare. What was more common was for a mother to carry a child to full term. And then for any number of reasons, it was culturally acceptable, socially acceptable, for any number of reasons to treat that child to what was called exposure. If the child was not the gender that you wanted, or if it had some type of a disability or a disfigurement, or if it was simply inconvenient. It was a totally normal practice for that child to be taken outside of the city and left on the garbage dump for the gods to deal with. And often those children that were treated to exposure would die there outside of the city. But even more often, they would be picked up and carried into slavery. Roman history is really clear, and I'll try to be, again, discreet for some of you that have children in the room, but that a significant amount of the slave force in ancient Roman history, particularly when it comes to some of the most horrific types of slavery, came from children that were picked up off of the trash heap after exposure and carried into service of those days. So very early on, the early church made it a practice to make daily trips through the town dump and to rescue those children, bring them into their homes, and adopt them into their family. Great personal, financial, and even social cost to themselves. But again, it wasn't just the unborn. It was the prisoner. You realize it was the followers of Jesus who put an end to the ancient practice of the gladiatorial games, where prisoners, before or after they were convicted, were fed to wild animals for sport. But it was also the sick during early plagues, when families felt like they had no option but to take their sick and dying loved ones and put them out on the street to protect themselves. It was the Christians who came along and collected them to offer them dignity all the way to their last breath, and as a result found themselves nursing many of them back to health. It was the early followers of Jesus who started the world's first orphanages. It was the early followers of Jesus who started the world's first foster care systems. It was the early followers of Jesus who started the world's first hospitals, over and over and over at great cost to themselves, personally, financially, and socially. Early Christ followers quietly and courageously lived on the side of life. Well, where did that come from for them? Why did it matter so much to them? Well, it came from, at least initially, a conviction rooted in God's first declaration about humanity. Genesis chapter 1, verse 7, first page of the Bible, God creates mankind, and the scriptures say he created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God declares at the very beginning of the story of people that every single person is created in the image of God, period, full stop. The implication of that from the very beginning, what you do to the image is what you would do to what the image represents if the person or thing that the image represents was right there in front of you. That's even still true today. If you spit on the image of a king, It's symbolic of saying this is what I would do to the king if he is in front of me. If you desecrate or deface or destroy a statue of a ruler, you're making a statement about the ruler themselves. And Jesus picks this up, and you remember what Jesus says? What you do to the least of these among you, you're doing to me. Every single person deserves dignity. Every person deserves esteem, deserves the chance to flourish by virtue of the fact that they're created in the image of God. That's a biblical conviction. But we have to go further even than that. Because one of the fundamental questions, especially in the contemporary conversation, becomes, well, when does a person become a person? And actually the scriptures give us some help on that as well. You've got Psalm 139 open in front of you. Look at Psalm chapter 139, verse 13, as David reflects on when he believes he became a person. Look what he says in verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Similarly, in Jeremiah chapter 1, God says about Jeremiah, he says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Put all of that together. When it comes to the scriptures, the Bible really isn't ambiguous. Every person from the moment of conception is distinct and designed with dignity and destiny. Now, I don't want to spend a ton of time there because I want us to see Jesus model this in real life, in real time. But notice a couple of things about that definition in that passage. You see the word distinct there. Do you notice in both the Psalm and in Jeremiah, from conception, David says, before I was even formed physically, even in the secret place, before my mom could know or even begin to show, I was me. God says to Jeremiah, you were you. Even then, more than just a part of a mother's body, as important and as intimate as that connection is. And by the way, science tells us that too. Unborn people have unique DNA right from the very beginning. They have unique blood types and circulatory systems and nervous systems and hearts and brains, intimately connected to the body of a mother and unique and distinct at the very same time. Distinct and designed. You can't get away from that in those passages either, can you? You can't get away from the handmade imagery as God talks about these unborn people without any reference to the circumstances of the conception, without any reference to the physical condition or the mental capacity of the person being designed. Every single person is designed with destiny and a future and days that are numbered by their designer before a single one comes to be. Look, think about that for just a second, especially if you're a person that doesn't follow Jesus, or if you're a person who does follow Jesus but really struggle with the conviction that I've just stated. Every single one of us want to live in a world that believes that about us, don't we? That's why the resistance of the early church was so compelling. They didn't just express that about themselves. They didn't just expect it for themselves. They expressed it for every single person that crossed their path. That's why the world around them said, I'm not sure I agree with your worldview, but I want to live in that kind of world. It wasn't just about the unborn for them. It's not just about the unborn for Christ followers in most parts of the world, and it can't just be about the unborn for us. Early followers of Jesus came to be known by the world of champions of every single life that crossed their path, especially lives that were unwanted, or inconvenient, or disregarded, or cast aside by the rest of the world for any reason at all. They showed dignity and esteem and care and protection and sacrifice and help of all kinds in order to give every single person on earth a chance to flourish. Where did they learn to live like that? Well, flip over to Luke 18. Luke chapter 18, they learned it from the life of Jesus. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but interesting to this conversation, have you ever thought about the fact that the story of God becoming flesh and dwelling among us begins with the announcement of an unwanted pregnancy? But you notice it's not just that. That two of the very first people to hear and respond to the news of Jesus are an unborn child that John the Baptist leapt in his mother's womb, and an elderly couple who had been put out to pasture who was well beyond their years of usefulness in the world, a couple named Simeon and Anna. It's Jesus who in Luke 18 says, "Let the little children come to me." Are you there? You see that in verse 16? Children were seen in those days as at best an inconvenience. Jesus says they're more valuable to me than you think. But then what you might not have ever noticed in that passage, if you just continue to look through the rest of that chapter, on through that chapter and into the beginning of the next chapter, you see several different examples of people, from the children to a rich young ruler, to the person that we're going to look briefly at in a moment, to an outcast tax collector, all people that the world had a tendency to misassign value to, one way or the other. But if you look at all of them, Jesus champions the life of every single one of the persons listed in this narrative, to the point that he says right in the middle of it, I value their life so much that I'm willing to give up my life for the sake of theirs. And one of them that I think is especially important to this conversation, because he touches both sides of the conversation and every conversation in between, from abortion to euthanasia and all of the conversations in the middle of that, this guy touches because he's a person who's vulnerable, a person who's disabled. It's the blind guy in Luke 18, verse 35. Do you see his story beginning there in verse 35? It tells us that Jesus was in the region of Jericho, and we don't have time to go into all of that right now, but Jericho was way outside of Jesus' socio-political environment. It would be like a stereotypical Texan walking around in California, or vice versa. That's the kind of scenario where Jesus is walking around there. So already out of his element. And there's this blind guy that's sitting by the road begging, who hears the commotion of followers of Jesus all passing by, and he wants to know what's going on. So he says, hey, what's going on? And they tell him, well, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And that causes him to go bonkers, because he's heard stories about Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus of Nazareth is a person who lives towards people like him, unlike the rest of the world is willing to live towards people like him. And sure enough, even in this story, you see the people begin to try to silence him and push him to the margins. Out of sight, out of mind. But Jesus stops. In fact, look at verse 40. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, I want to see, he replied. Jesus said to him, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. And check this out. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. So the compelling resistance is contagious. This guy starts a parade, and he's leading it. Really quickly, I think you see three things about the way that Jesus lives towards this person that can guide us as we try to engage life in real life, wherever we go. First thing you see is the pause. You see it there in verse 40. You notice it? Jesus pauses long enough to notice and be bothered by something and someone that the rest of the world doesn't want to see. And I wonder if that's not a word for some of us today. Maybe especially for some of us who started today feeling like being pro-life was primarily something political. For some of us to pause and consider perhaps an unborn person that for any number of reasons the world would love to see as anything but that. But also for some of us to pause and consider the story of people who tend to be pushed to the margin of the other side. The terrified teenager, the overwhelmed parents, the victim of violence, the person with a limitation of one kind or another, the thousands of lonely, largely abandoned people in nursing homes and often in neighborhoods right near where we live. If we'll pause long enough to see the people that the parades and the protests miss, I wonder if we might not find ourselves looking with the eyes of Jesus. The pause. But the second thing you see in Jesus, you see him pause, and then you see it's personal. This person is not a political issue to Jesus. This life is not just a statistic to Jesus. This is a human being with a name and a need, and Jesus takes the time to get to know both. That's really important in the story, and it's really important to us who want to live the way of Jesus in a world like ours. And then the last thing you see, right, the word partner. Partner. Pause, personal, and then partner. Think about this. As this guy walks up to Jesus, does Jesus know what this guy needs? Does this guy know what this guy needs? Heck, the whole world knows what this guy needs in this moment, doesn't it? So why does Jesus ask him, what do you want me to do for you? There are probably several right answers to the question. It gives the man a chance to declare his faith and to say out loud who he believes Jesus is and what he believes Jesus is capable of. But do you notice it also gives an opportunity for Jesus to demonstrate something about who he believes this man is? You notice Jesus gives him agency and dignity by inviting him to speak for himself. He doesn't just assume his story. He doesn't just assume a simple solution to the story. I think that's a really powerful part of the personal interaction here Jesus has with this man. He doesn't just assume where the guy's been or the solution that seems simple to everyone. He pauses and gets personal and then lets the man surface it himself. So that leads to us. Those of us that want to follow Jesus in life with convictions and compassion and courage in a world like this, living for life in a world where life isn't always valued. How do we live with nothing less than Christ-centered conviction, but also with absolutely nothing less than Christ-centered compassion and courage as well? Maybe just give you a couple of potential steps and places to look as you design something for you personally. Obviously, we've got a couple of really great ministry partners that you ought to know about. Pregnancy Lifeline is one of them. They've been a partner of ours for decades, literally. And let me just say, if you're one of those people who is suspicious of crisis pregnancy centers for one reason or another, can I just say out loud, sometimes your suspicion is with good reason. That is not these people. You need to get to know these people. They meet families in crisis pregnancy situations and walk them through a decision, always encouraging them towards life. But listen, never ever tricking them, never ever deceiving them. That happens in the world. It does not happen there. And from there, they love these families and individuals, and they help them live with the decisions that they make. Everything from trauma-informed intervention to helping victims walk through the legal system, to parenting classes, to helping with clothes, to helping with job training and skills, to help whole families flourish. And there are opportunities for some of us to get involved in something like that, especially if you've got a story or some training in one of those areas, or if you're looking for a place to invest financially. That's one option for you. Hope Local is another one you may or may not be aware of. It's an organization that's on a mission to solve the foster care system in our state. Helping individuals like you think through, how can we better serve families who have made that decision? And how do we help get information for people who could make that next step your next step on something like this? There is no reason that the church shouldn't be able to provide a solution to a system that is really broken in our world. And really, frankly, that gives some families with unborn children some really terrifying answers to the question, what if I can't provide for this child? We can do better in the world as the church. We must, if we want to stand for this. Maybe there's a personal step closer to home. What would it take for you, for the church to be the first place that a person would want to turn when they find themselves with an unplanned pregnancy? What would it take from you for the church or for followers of Jesus to be the first person someone called as a victim after they call the police? What would it take for people with disabilities, vulnerabilities, and their families on your street, for the elderly person on your block or in the nursing home near you to experience dignity and esteem and to continue living to their God-ordained destiny for every single one of their God-numbered days? Might we find that a culture of compelling resistance can still slowly change the world for the better, not by raging against the current, but by patiently resisting it, and regardless of the cost to us, choosing to live life in a more compelling way. Would you bow your head with me? Lord, for those who perhaps have come to this moment and are hearing of a Jesus that's different from the Jesus that they heard of on TV, I pray that they would understand that you see their life as so valuable that you would give up your life for theirs. And whatever they bring to this moment, whatever their story, however complicated, that you are a God who sees them and knows the depths of it and will be present with them. Forgive their sins, come to live with them and to give them hope and a future and power to live it from here and on through eternity, that they would receive that gift as a gift today. Lord, for some of us that come with stories that are complicated and broken and perhaps have shame that has just been unearthed, Lord, would you make it so clear to us how you handle shame? That you put it on yourself and you carry it away, that you put it in the grave and come out without it, and you offer us freedom and hope forever and ever and ever. And Lord, for some of us who frankly have not engaged this conversation well over the years, for some of us who have not followed you in this, even though we feel like we have a biblical conviction, would you let us be people who from this moment walk with Christ-centered compassion, willing to get our hands and our lives and our finances involved in the lives of the people around us? Would you let us follow you in this and live a resistance in the world in a way that's compelling and filled with Christ-centered love every place we put our feet? We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.